Hey girls, it's me. I'm coming to you from my kitchen this time, and we're going to do session 9 of Proverbs, but I want to share with you my tomato canning. See, I have canned about 123 quarts of tomato juice so far, and if you look over there, I got about maybe 28 to 30 more. And then I'll be shutting down the cannon of tomato juice, and I hope to have close to 150, and then I'll be done with that. So now let's find ourselves back in Proverbs. We're in session 9. Our background scriptures are Proverbs 22, verse 17, through chapter 24, verse 22. Focusing on chapter 23, verses 17 through 21, and then move to verses 29 through 35. Today's lesson in Proverbs, in our textbook of daily practical living wisdom from King Solomon, is entitled Staying Sober. God expects believers to be good stewards of the bodies that he has given us. So Solomon taught God's people about the dangers of alcohol abuse and the wisdom of avoiding strong drink. This session emphasizes that we're to be good stewards of our physical bodies, not just good stewards with our money and spiritually. So in Proverbs 22, verses 17 through 24, verses 22, which is all the background scriptures for today's lesson, is sometimes referred to as the words of the wise, or the 30 sayings of the wise. Proverbs 22, 17 through 21 functions as an introduction to this 30 sayings. The identification of these sayings as the words of the wise suggests that Solomon's role was in collecting and recording these proverbs. Indeed, he may have written some of the sayings, while also collecting and preserving others that were written by certain Israelite wisdom teachers in Solomon's administration. So the purpose behind the 30 sayings was to help young, promising Israelites cultivate a deeper faith in God and build this reputation of integrity. There are some similarities between some of the sayings and some Egyptian wisdom sayings. These resemblances demonstrate that other ancient peoples also recognized and promoted a few basic ethical norms. Probably it was the propensity of other nations to engage in idolatry that led them over time to twist and pervert these moral understandings of right and wrong. Now, the Apostle Paul contended in Romans 1:18 through 23 that getting the truth about God wrong leads inevitably to corrupt thinking. That in turn leads to corrupt and immoral behavior. So Solomon likewise contended from the start that true ethical behavior springs from a right relationship with the Lord. So Proverbs chapter 22 then, verses 22 through 23, verse 11, probes the desires for wealth. The first saying warns against acquired wealth by exploiting the poor. The Lord is sometimes described as the protector of the poor, a distinctive attribute of Israel's God. The second saying seems to caution against criminal alliances for illicit gain. Saying 3 strongly advises against borrowing money recklessly. Saying 4 prohibits illegally moving property markers, especially markers of tribal boundaries. In ancient Israel's thought, God owned the promised land. Still does. And he allocated its territories to the 12 tribes, distributing specific areas among the clans and families within a tribe. So this allocation was so sacred that during the year of Jubilee, all property reverted to its original assignees. So in saying 10, God announced he personally would defend those wronged in this matter. Saying 5 through saying 9 delineate the legal and the ethical relationships between the rich and the powerful, and then the average person. Saying 9 indicates that any effort to teach some people was a waste of time because they will cling stubbornly to their preconceived views. So then Proverbs 23, chapter verse 12 through 28 contains similar proverbs on the subject of parenting. The 11th saying admonishes students to listen to their teachers and to study relentlessly. The 12th saying addresses the use of corporal punishment. Sayings 14 and 15 are examined in the comments for this session. Then saying 16 encourages children to make their parents proud and to care for them when they are old. Saying 17 forbids immoral sexual activity. Sayings 19 through 30 are found in Proverbs chapter 23, verses 29 through chapter 24, verse 22. And these sayings condemn drunkenness, violent associates, and worry. This section warns about the frailty of evil schemes and foretells the ultimate victory of righteousness. It promotes the advantage gained through wisdom, compassion towards vulnerable people, and humility. So let's read these verses. Chapter 23, verses 17. Don't let your heart envy sinners. Instead, always fear the Lord, for then you will have a future and your hope will not be dashed. Verse 18. Verse 19, listen, my son, and be wise. Keep your mind on the right course. Verse 20, don't associate with those who drink too much wine or with those who gorge themselves on meat. For the drunkard and the glutton will become poor, and grogginess will clothe them in rags. Verse 29, who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who has conflicts? Who has complaints? Who has wounds for no reason? Who has red eyes? Verse 30, those who linger over wine, those who go looking for mixed wine. Verses 31 and 32, don't gaze at wine because it is red, because it gleams in the cup and goes down smoothly. In the end, it bites like a snake and it stings like a viper. Verse 33, your eyes will see strange things and you will say absurd things. Verse 34, you'll be like someone sleeping out at sea or lying down on the top of a ship's mast. Verse 35, they struck me, but I feel no pain. They beat me, but I didn't know it. When will I wake up? I'll look for another drink. Sounds like Solomon had some personal knowledge of all this, to be honest with you. Let's go back and unpack these scriptures. Kind of breaks this down, our writer does, in 4 segments. The first being the promise. Don't let your heart envy sinners. Instead, always fear the Lord. So to live in appropriate fear of the Lord is to choose to love God above all else. Salvation through faith in Jesus Christ is this once for all time decision that settles our eternal destiny forever. However, the process of growing in faith is an ongoing decision to follow the Lord in obedience, one step after another, one day after another, for the rest of our lives. This is our journey, girls, of sanctification. So verse 18 says, for then you will have a future, and your hope will not be dashed. So verse 17, those who fear the Lord and trust in him can count on a secure and a hopeful future. To help God's people know and understand this promise now, Solomon gave 2 pieces of wise counsel. First, he returned to the principle first laid down way back in Proverbs 1, chapter 7. It is the fear and reverent awe of the Lord that is the basis of wisdom. So rather than developing a jealousy towards worldly wisdom of the sinful and secular, Solomon directed God's people to stay grounded in loving and fearing the Lord. The fear of the Lord tethers us to ultimate reality and unchanging truth. So then verse 18 means that this promise of God's presence assures us future hope. This is the second great truth which Solomon reminded God's people of, so they might continually embrace the wisdom of God. Solomon combined 2 great themes of life, hope and wisdom. Walking in God's wisdom keeps alive the promise of a future with purpose and hope. To neglect the wisdom of God will cut short or stunt a future with purpose and hope. So believers are to fear God alone, finding their security and hope in Him alone. We are to discard these worldly desires and to receive God's full blessing. God is faithful and will do everything He promises for His people. So the next subsection of today's lesson is called the petition. Solomon petitioned God's people to avoid the heavy drinker and the glutton. He emphasized that such lifestyles lead to poverty. Verse 19, listen, my son, and be wise. Keep your mind on the right course. Don't associate with those who drink too much wine or with those who gorge themselves on meat. Verse 21, for the drunkard and the glutton will become poor, and grogginess will clothe them in rags. Kind of interesting. When Solomon referred to the mind here in verse 19, he meant the thinking process of God's people. How and what a person thinks when it comes to the critical junctures of life makes all the difference. A sound mind filled with the wisdom of God will be better able to make those right choices and avoid the bad choices that can derail us. Solomon's wise counsel to God's people was for them to stay the course set by the wisdom of God. His instruction was for us to remain clear-headed. So alcohol and substance abuse can cut short a person's potential and hope-filled future. Solomon petitioned God's people to not associate with those who drink too much wine, with those who gorge themselves on meat. Both drunkenness and gluttony can lead to poverty of body and of soul. Both alcohol and food sometimes function as medicines that numb us to the difficulties and pains of life. God's people are to trust God in difficult times, not turning to vices such as alcohol or overeating for comfort in the process. That numbing effects of drunkenness and overeating are only short. They're short-term fixes for what may be a set of long-term problems. So when the effects of self-medication and gluttony are gone, the problems will remain. A lot of times they're amplified. So in these verses, Solomon addressed two important yet sensitive issues. First, he addressed alcohol abuse. His counsel was simple. Disassociate yourself from the abuse of alcohol. Abusing alcohol opens up the individual for all kinds of harm and causes a person to become entangled in a subculture that is often harmful, toxic, and detrimental to so many areas of life. And secondly, he addressed the often neglected issue of gluttony. A drunkard will keep buying alcohol until all of his money is gone. By the same token, Solomon warned that the glutton will become poor. Shoving food in our mouths usually leaves us groggy. The grogginess leaves us unable to be productive. When we work as a result of our lack of control, we'll end up wearing rags. Simple progression in Solomon's mind. In our culture, we tend to abhor drunkenness, but we don't usually have that same attitude about gluttony. However, God's wisdom at work in us prompts us to treat both of them in the same way. Instead of giving in to them, we handle our difficult trials by trusting the Lord to help us get through the challenges of life. So the consequences of alcohol abuse and gluttony are clear and they're stark. The consequences are physical, mental, financial, relational, and spiritual. How many lives have been wasted by alcohol abuse, cut short by the effects of unhealthy habits? How many families have been ripped apart? God's people need to stay sharp. We need to stay focused and fully engaged in life, living within the guidelines of God's wisdom. So alcohol and food abuse diminish this possibility. Therefore, Solomon petitioned God's people to demonstrate wisdom and accountability in these two areas of life. Believers, now, here's a caution. Believers should not misunderstand Solomon's counsel about not associating with those who suffer from addictions. Scripture assumes that God's people must have contact with others in order to share the gospel with them and to offer them compassionate help in their situations of distress. The warning, however, is not to become so closely associated that we're drawn in to their self-destructive lifestyles. In other words, we are not to envy sinners. After all, we are sinners too. But we are to choose the Lord's way above all. Wisdom dictates that our closest friendships and relationships be built on a common foundation of faith in God. Then our writer brings us to the third little subsection called the portrait. Now, Solomon portrayed the abuse of strong drink as a seducing the user who later finds out that he or she has been poisoned by it. The thought of escaping from the troubles of life added to the initial allure. So in verse 29, who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who has conflicts? Who has complaints? Who has wounds for no reason? Who has red eyes? Verse 30, those who linger over wine, those who go looking for mixed wine. Verses 31 through 32, don't gaze at wine because it is red, because it gleams in the cup and goes down smoothly. In the end, it bites like a snake and it stings like a viper. So verses 29 through 32, pretty self-explanatory, and it was for Solomon. Solomon portrayed this abuse of alcohol in vivid terms. He described the appeal and the enticement of alcohol. It gleams in the cup and it goes down smoothly. But in the end, it bites like a snake. So on the front end, things seem good and acceptable. And oh, the back end, the ramifications of alcohol abuse are horrible. The thought of escaping from the troubles of life by indulging in self-medication only adds to the initial allure, but the temptations offered by the abuse of alcohol will never meet your expectations. The consequences of alcohol abuse are many and they're varied. The loss of reason, abusive and belligerent behavior, and even the open demonstration of physical signs of alcohol abuse overpromises and it underperforms. So the culture in which we live today is inundated with all kinds of advertisements when it comes to the consumption of alcohol. What is missing is the downside of alcohol industry. They don't make those kind of commercials. Those who abuse alcohol are portrayed as the people who live the good life. What needs to be talked about are the ravaging effects of alcohol abuse and other addictive substances on both individuals and on families and then communities. So then we come to the fourth and final little subsection of our studying of staying sober with Solomon. The problem? Solomon described the problem of addiction, pointing to senseless and harmful actions taken by the drunkard. Even after the senseless and harmful actions are realized, the addicted person seeks another drink. Verse 33, your eyes will see strange things, and you will say absurd things. 34, you'll be like someone sleeping out at sea or lying down on the top of a ship's mast. 35, they strike me, but I feel no pain. They beat me, but I didn't know it. When will I wake up? I'll look for another drink. Verses 33 through 35 here at the last section of our study. In these verses, the description of the consequences of alcohol's use and abuse continue. It is vivid and in stark terms. Solomon pictured the abuse of alcohol as someone who sees strange things. That's the loss of your mental reasoning. And will say all kinds of abusive or absurd things to others. People who abuse alcohol lose their mental capacities and the ability to demonstrate self-control. In addition, Solomon pictured the drunkard as a person asleep at the helm of a ship. The drunkard is lethargic and mentally incapacitated. Only one thing matters for a person suffering from addiction. Not even being struck or beaten would be of a greater concern. The pressing problem for a drunk has to do with getting another drink. That need alone would prompt someone who's drunk to wake up from the stupor brought on by alcohol. Waking up would be difficult because of the influence of alcohol, and it would be potent. However, this person is in search of another drink and would work hard to get out of bed and look for another drink. And where my dad was concerned, one drink was too many, and 1,000 was not enough. So with this description, the problem of alcohol abuse and drug abuse has been underscored for believers. Without question, the addictive behaviors and the consequences of alcohol abuse and substance abuse can be devastating. Solomon's description in these verses of alcohol affects challenges us to give control of our bodies to the Lord alone. Because this is far from the kind of life God intended for us to have when He created human beings and when He sent His Son, Jesus Christ, to save us from our sins. Indeed, Christ came that we might be set free and may have life and have it more abundantly. John 10:10. So this was a pretty, Solomon was pretty upfront, in your face, and to the point. Now, session 10, I get around to that one, I got to hurry up and get around to it because we're going back to Sunday school in person. Today is August the 10th, and session 10 is due. That was session 9. Session 10 will be called Accepting Discipline. And this is going to be a tough one too. So girls, y'all better study. There's going to be a test. I emailed everyone a copy. I looked up all the verses, typed them all out for you. Now these are all, I prepared all of these for you guys, and they're in the New King James Version. All these verses are. I use my Inspirational Study Bible for this. Okay, girls, I'll see you guys later. Patty out.